Today, we're diving into a really provocative idea from author Joshua Lou McDermott. The argument is simple, but huge. The way we've made sense of the world for the last 40 years, it just doesn't work anymore. So, he's proposing a whole new framework for the times we're living in, and he calls it the age of supraliberalism. Now, it's a pretty challenging concept, so let's unpack it together. I mean, think about it. We use labels all the time to get our bearings, right? Left versus right, liberal, conservative. Maybe you've even heard the term neoliberalism. But do these concepts, these old political maps, do they actually describe the world we're all living in today? The author here argues that no, they don't. He thinks they're hopelessly outdated and that we desperately need a new map if we're going to navigate our present reality. And yeah, that really gets to the heart of the problem he's trying to solve. As he puts it, the present political moment is often only fully understood in hindsight. But the argument is we can't afford to just wait and see. If we want to make sense of the world we're in right now, we need a better way to understand all the economic and political forces that are shaping our lives as they happen. Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at why the author thinks our old map is basically gone. Then, we'll take a quick look back at the era he says just ended, the Neoliberal Age. After that, we'll get into the main idea, Supraliberalism, and its 11 key features. And to wrap it all up, we'll look at the path forward that the author lays out. So, the author kicks things off with a pretty bold claim. The dominant ideology of the last 40 years, something called neoliberalism, is dead. Over. He points to the 2008 financial crisis as the moment it all started to crumble, and argues that for more than a decade now, we've been living in, well, whatever came next. So before we can understand where we are, we have to get a handle on where the author says we've been. He boils down the neoliberal age to two core ideas. First, this deep, almost religious faith that an unrestrained free market could solve pretty much any problem. And second, a belief in a limited but still working liberal government. A big part of this, he says, was something called technocratic elitism. You know, the idea that the really big decisions should be made by experts, away from the messiness of public opinion. This combination, that's the old map he says we've left behind. But how did we even get that neoliberal world in the first place? Well, the author gives us a quick history lesson to set the stage for why he thinks it all fell apart. So the story goes something like this. After World War II, you had these really strong welfare states in the West and a wave of anti-colonial movements around the world. But then, in the 1970s, that whole system hits a crisis with oil shocks and new competition. And out of that chaos, in the 1980s, a new idea emerges, what's often called the Washington Consensus. This was the birth of neoliberalism. The author argues that its policies of privatization and deregulation were really designed to weaken the power of labor. And this model basically ruled the world for decades, until, as he claims, the 2008 financial crash came along and dealt it a death blow. Okay, so if neoliberalism is dead, what took its place? This is the big question, and this is where the author introduces his central idea, supraliberalism. It's his name for this new, wild, uncharted territory we're all trying to navigate now. Now, this is a super important point in his argument. Supraliberalism is not the opposite of neoliberalism. The pendulum didn't just swing back the other way. Instead, the author argues it's more like an intensification, a mutation. It's what you get when all the problems and all the contradictions of the old system are just left to fester and grow until they evolve into something else, something more extreme. This chart really puts it all into perspective. So under neoliberalism, you had this supposed balance between the market and government. But in the age of superliberalism, the author argues the market has basically eaten the state. Where liberal values were once at least a good story, now he says they're just window dressing. The hypocrisy is out in the open. And this last point is maybe the most jarring. The argument that the kind of brutality and instability once exported to other places has now boomeranged, and it's come home. Okay, so that's the big picture theory. But what does this new era actually look and feel like day to day? To answer that, the author breaks it down into 11 specific features that, for him, define this age of superliberalism. Yep, 11 of them. To make them a little easier to digest, we're going to look at them in 3 groups. We'll start with the big stuff, how power and government are changing. First up, power. The author says we're now in a multipolar world. No single superpower is running the show anymore. Instead, you have these big global blocs competing. Second, trade becomes totally cynical. You get protectionism for the rich and powerful at home, while free trade is still forced on everyone else. Third, what he calls oligarchy, or rule by the super-rich, isn't hiding anymore. It's right out in the open. And finally, regulatory capture, which basically means the line between the government and the corporations it's supposed to be watching, well, that line just disappears. Next up, let's look at society and culture. He points to something called identity essentialism, this post-truth idea where your group identity is supposed to explain everything about you. Then there's total militarization, where it seems like every social problem, from schools to the border, gets treated like a national security threat. Third is commodification, the idea that absolutely everything, nature, relationships, your time, is turned into a product with a price tag. And finally, there's that term again, blowback, the idea that the violence once sent outward by powerful nations starts to show up back home. All right, our final set of features is all about technology and ideology. First is this worship of technology as the solution to all our problems, even while it's being used to create massive surveillance systems. He also argues that the climate crisis, instead of being solved, is actually being leveraged and turned into a new market for elites to profit from. And finally, he says a rabid anti-communism underpins everything. And it's really important to get his definition here. He doesn't just mean opposition to old communist countries, but a deep hostility to any organized challenge to the power of capital. So, after painting what is, let's be honest, a pretty bleak picture of the world, the author doesn't just leave us there. The book actually ends by proposing what he sees as the only real path toward a different kind of future. And this quote pretty much says it all. For the author, the solution isn't some small policy tweak or a new politician. No, he's talking about a fundamental challenge to the whole system. And he argues that the only force on earth powerful enough to do that is what he calls a united and broadly defined working class. So what would this movement actually try to achieve? Well, according to the author, it comes down to 4 huge goals. First, to overthrow the current ruling class. Second, to finally implement rational, serious policies to stop the climate crisis. Third, to end systemic inequality with universal programs. And finally, the biggest goal of all, to build a totally different kind of society, one based on cooperation and equality. So there you have it. That's the theory of superliberalism in a nutshell. From its roots in the collapse of the old system to its 11 defining features and the author's proposed way out. It's a complex idea for sure, and definitely a controversial one. So the question we want to leave you with isn't whether the author is right or wrong. It's much simpler than that. Now that we've explored the map that he's drawn, how well does it describe the world you see around you every day?